Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to another week of the Global Café. My name is Kara Cruz, and I'm a policy and project coordinator here at the IFA. Today, I am very excited to be introducing you all to Dr. Laura Middleton and Mr. Bill Heibein, who will be speaking to us about the meaningful inclusion and participation of persons with dementia as a part of community wellness programs. As some of you may be aware, March is Brain Health Awareness Month, so this is the perfect way to end the month. Dr. Middleton is an associate professor in the Department of Kinesiology and Health Sciences at the University of Waterloo and the Schlegel Research Chair in Dementia and Active Aging at the University of Waterloo and Schlegel Research Institute for Aging. Dr. Middleton's research aims to identify strategies to promote health, well-being, and function of those living with or at risk for dementia. So she focuses on the role of physical activity and complementary lifestyle factors, recognizing that their broad impact on physical and social and mental well-being. Her research takes on a participatory approach, integrating the expertise and perspectives of people living with dementia, care partners, healthcare professionals, and community service providers as co-researchers to create accessible and effective supports and interventions. Recent projects aim to equip community service providers with the knowledge, skills, and confidence to support people living with dementia in their wellness programs and services. She is the co-lead of the Canadian Dementia Learning and Resource Network. And then Mr. Bill Heibein is one of the founders of the Ontario Dementia Advisory Group and former member of the Alzheimer's Society of Canada group of people with lived experience of dementia. He lives on a farm at Kakabeka Falls outside of Thunder Bay here in Canada and embraces the active lifestyle it creates. He has been a co-researcher for over a decade, working on research projects with Lakehead University, University of Waterloo, and other institutions across Canada. This includes his work with Dr. Middleton on the DICE, so Dementia Inclusive Choices for Exercise, and DREAM, which stands for the Dementia Resources for Exercise, Activity, and Meaningful Inclusion projects. And he shares his expertise and perspectives as a person living with dementia, a farmer, a musician, an active contributor to his community, and a proponent of a physically active lifestyle. He is an advocate for the values of vigorous physical activity to living well with dementia. Thank you both so much for joining us today. I know it's going to be a great hour of conversation. So to start off, I wanted to ask you both about how you came to be interested in the topic of dementia and health promotion more generally. So Laura, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. So I'll start with the health promotion and how I came to that, and then how I got to dementia, because that's probably the order. So I came specifically around physical activity. I came from a background of sport and physical activity in my own life. And so I guess continuing my interests, I started in basic science, but moved into what I know not everywhere across the world has it, but kinesiology. So science of movement and exercise is kind of where I moved into for my undergraduate degree and then my master's degree. But it was around this time that my aunt was diagnosed with early onset dementia. And of course, personal experience is often what brings you into, this field. And so she was diagnosed at 46 with dementia. My cousins were quite young at the time, 12, 14, and 16. And that really made my vision and perspective change. When I went to my PhD, I said, I have no background in dementia, but this is what I want to do. There had been a few studies around exercise and dementia at the time. And I was interested. Unfortunately, my future PhD supervisor said, yes, come on board. I'm interested in that as well. And so that was kind of the starting point. And of course, my move into more broader health promotion as opposed to, exercise and dementia in epidemiology, which is where I started, has evolved over the years and through collaborations and interactions and, being lucky to work with people like Bill.
Perfect. Thank you, Laura. And it's interesting, that idea of like a hunch of, I think there's something to this, really can lead us so far.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. How about Bill? Do you have a story you could share with us, Bill, about how you came to be here at the cafe?
My story starts in 2000. In January of 2000, at the age of 59, I was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's. At that time, I was given basically I was told I had 5 good years approximately. At the end of that 5 years, I wouldn't no doubt be in a home somewhere, whatever. Uh, at that time, I was a partner with Ernst& Young Chartered Accountants, but at the same time, my wife and I owned and operated Amethyst Farms, which was a um, farming operation under which we bred, trained, and have shown all registered quarter horses. Uh, I contacted, not knowing a whole lot about the disease. I did contact the Alzheimer's Society of Thunder Bay to try and get some information on it. Now, I had various meetings with them to try and find out the programs they were putting on. But after 5 years, because the diagnosis did not advance to the stage it was supposed to, they again ran me through all of the testing that was available at that time. And again, the same diagnosis, early onset Alzheimer's, but this time they said basically, we will give you 3 years because you've already made 5, which we did not expect. At that time, and again through the Alzheimer's Society, I got involved in a referral and support program. Dr. Elaine Wiersma, University of Lakehead University, approached that group looking for volunteers in one of her projects. I got involved with her. She has connections into University of Waterloo. I was involved with the various organizations in Ontario to do with dementia. Laura came looking for volunteers at that organization. I got involved with Laura, and the rest is history.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And how fortunate we are that you're able to be here with us. So you are also a founding member of the Ontario Dementia Advisory Group. What led you to create this group, and what is its function?
That particular group is no longer in operation, but the idea behind it was to try and draw people from across Ontario as a support basis online where we could sit, meet, chat, find out what was going on in other portions of the province, and et cetera, et cetera. So really, to me, it was as much of a support for me as it was a learning opportunity for everybody involved.
Perfect. Thank you. So Laura, as it was mentioned in your bio, you are the principal investigator of both the Dementia Inclusive Choices for Exercise, the DICE project, and the Dementia Resources for Exercise, Activity, and Meaningful Inclusion, the DREAM project. How are these projects informed by community members, including people with dementia? And also, I'm just curious what you mean by meaningful inclusion.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first piece I would say is, people living with dementia have been involved since, I think with DICE, so Dementia Inclusive Choices of Exercise, I reached out to Lisa Lozel, was the first person, and the Alzheimer's Society. The Alzheimer's Society I was already collaborating with regarding exercise, so that made sense. And I said, I have this idea, this is what I want to do, but I have to think about how to do it. And Lisa, Bill had known Lisa, she had done a lot of participatory work before. And together we decided, well, the first thing we need to do is find out if this idea resonates with people living with dementia. And if so, see if we can identify a couple people who want to be really part of the research team in the project. So we actually went first to the Ontario Dementia Advisory Group. And so we were fortunate. I gave a brief presentation about what I was thinking, and that the idea behind it is if we can train people who are providing these programs in the community to understand dementia and include people living with dementia, then we can, it expands the programs and services they have access to. So we're not always relying on a specific specialized program for people with dementia, but they can access everything. And so Bill, fortunately, the ODEG as a whole approved, believed in the concept behind the project, and Bill and then another member at the time, Carol Johannesson, both signed on to be part of the project right from the beginning. And so they were the core members of the research team. Carol's husband was also part of the research team, as well as people from a number of different community organizations, including the Alzheimer's Society, the YMCAs that are available in a number of countries, the municipal members of the local municipality that were involved in senior services. I'm trying to think. Also healthcare, so physicians, we had a number of physicians that were on the team as well. And so they were really involved in making all the decisions on what we did. We had a guiding road that we thought might be where we went, but it really changed along the way. And I think it was my first time doing a participatory project. So it probably took longer than it might have otherwise, because I was also figuring it out with their guidance along the way, but it was really a fantastic experience and built really strong experiences amongst the team. We brought in additional advisors at various times, including, a nice group of people living with dementia, care partners who came into workshops or served as advisors at various decision points along the way. But really, the content, certainly the content of the training, how we evaluated was all informed by that team of advisors. And I would say Bill and Carol were probably the most consistent voices over the course of that. With a community organization, sometimes people move in and out. Physicians were there, but sometimes they're busy. They have clinical roles, and so they weren't at every meeting. And so I would say Bill and Carol were really, the most consistent voices in that team. In terms of meaningful inclusion, what I mean when I talk that is one that people are included in the activities that they want to participate in, that are meaningful to them individually, and as full participants that are included can participate in the activities that are planned for, when people are designing programs and services, so that they are true and full participants in their communities. Hopefully broadly, these focus on a few types of activities, physical activities, certainly healthy eating, meal times within the DREAM project, and wellness programs, but hopefully meaningful inclusion on all levels in their communities.
Thank you. And I'm curious, what was it like, and perhaps Bill, you can also maybe share your insights, to work with such a broad variety of individuals from different backgrounds. So you've got the physicians, you've got people with lived experience, you've got municipal folks, CSOs. Were there ever kind of any competing priorities, or like how did you all come to kind of inform this project?
Yeah, I'm curious Bill's standpoint, but I think we were really lucky in that people who had shared values in terms of listening to, respecting, valuing different opinions and perspectives were the people we had around the table. A couple of times at the beginning, we had a couple other physicians that were part of the team, and they were used to a little bit more of a top-down decision making. And so that, they were also busy. So I never had any conversation that meant that they didn't participate as often, but it kind of worked out well. Like, it really was a good collaboration that we really wanted to make change. So when we were designing, the training, we wanted things that people with dementia thought were important, but also that, reflected what people delivering exercise or delivering wellness programs needed. And so we were able, I think, to create something that was meaningful to both. But it really was, I think, the values of people, where they really valued different voices around the table and took it as an opportunity to learn as well. So I think that was part of the success, really.
Yeah, and kind of the joy of participatory research. Yeah, Bill, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, as Laura says, the majority of programs or anything involved with dementia It's designed by people who mean absolutely well in their programming, but they basically program something they think is going to be a benefit or interest to us. Laura's approach was bottoms up. She approached the people who have been diagnosed and living with this diagnosis and said, okay, now what do you think would be a benefit? And the approach was different.
Mhm.
Yeah, and it must have made that difference to be able to actually inform instead of being told what you should be interested in, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, go ahead,
I just
Laura.
wanted to add on, I mean, I think one of the things that came out that, just as a researcher, I might not have been as aware of or thought to include, and now, it's kind of an essential focus for everything, is really emphasizing the rights of people with dementia to inclusion, using, the UN TRPD or other human rights framework, that they have a right to these supports. They have a right to inclusion. They have a right to participation in their communities and support for their health and well-being. And so I do think that is something I wouldn't necessarily have thought of to put in, although it has been more of a guiding light, but I don't know if I would have put it in the training. And I do think that's something that's really resonated with providers, and appropriately so, that, oh, okay, I need to change my thinking. It's not just I'm kind of doing this to support them or to be a good person. I'm doing this because they have a right to inclusion. So I should be planning for this from the beginning.
Okay, so transitioning from like this charity model to more
Exactly.
like this human rights focused model.
That's right. That's right.
That's really interesting. Thank you. So Bill, you've been engaged with numerous research in numerous universities. What's it like for you to participate in this research?
I find it particularly interesting. As you mentioned, I'm involved from coast to coast, various universities in the research. And to hear the ideas that are coming out of other areas and other people, I'm probably to some degree involved in this more as a learning experience for myself. If I can find out something that another person is doing that I think is going to benefit me, I'm more than eager to try it. Plus, the more people involved with this diagnosis can be seen actively participating, I think goes against the stigma that goes along with this.
Yeah, it challenges that narrative
Correct.
of someone with dementia being frail and unable
Yep.
To meaningfully engage. So speaking about meaningful kind of engagement and inclusion, we have a question from Shmuel. So Shmuel is a regular contributor to our global cafes. And he is asking, how can the meaningful and full inclusion of older adults in society kind of reduce the risk of dementia as they age? So I'm not sure, Laura, if you could speak a little bit to this.
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, I do think that the meaningful and full inclusion of people with dementia has a few effects. Oh, your meaningful engagement of older adults.
I think older adults in general.
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, I would say as a whole, and this is, my interpretation, of course, of dementia risk reduction, is that the best advice in terms of what is controllable on the individual level. So I'm taking away, the treatment of health conditions from part of that, and that's certainly part of dementia risk reduction. But if we look at the things that are controllable at a individual societal level, because of course we know behavior is not just the individual level, it's really about engagement, right? It's physical engagement, social engagement, cognitive engagement. Those are, access to food, but often, food and meals are meaningful engagement, right? That you're more likely to eat better when you're eating with others. Meaningful engagement can be core to everything, right? If we learn nothing from the COVID-19 pandemic, when people are isolated, their mental and physical well-being decreases. Absolutely. Their cognitive well-being. And none of this is tracked as well. So as well as we might have liked, given the restrictions. But we know isolation is not good for anyone. Social isolation, it's a huge predictor. So I think, in my mind, meaningful engagement is core to dementia risk reduction, but risk reduction in so many different ways.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I have a follow-up question from Elizabeth Lewis. So I'm not sure, Elizabeth, if you'd like to unmute to ask your question, or I can ask it.
Yeah, I just was wondering, sort of, as a researcher, have you encountered sort of any ethical considerations that you...
Oh, sorry, Elizabeth,
Oh, sorry. Any sort of ethical limitations or barriers or things that sort of came up in your research that you might have not considered before that you would suggest researchers to consider when focusing on research for folks with dementia?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think that institutional ethics bodies treat engagement of people living with dementia very differently, depending where you're at and their experience with research that's living with dementia. I mean, to me, one of the most important things is that we seek consent when possible, and certainly assent from the people living with dementia. That's not always a focus of the ethics bodies. Our institutional body is quite strong in this and are very progressive in terms of understanding the rights of people living with dementia to consent, to choose to participate in research. And so I think that's a big piece that some institutions need to move forward in. I think there is always the issue of recognizing changing capacity too, and changing views. So I think consent is often an ongoing conversation rather than a one-time engagement at the beginning of research, is ensuring that, and that's good practice probably broadly, but because things may change and it's good to seek and have that conversation regularly. We do try to give people their own consent as long as they have capacity. So they may have other people in their lives that are, have decision making for healthcare or for their finances, but often people still can make decisions. And so we try to respect that as long as possible for their participation. I think the biggest challenge is how do we keep respect of those principles of autonomy as people get into the moderate to severe stage, and how do we still give them the opportunity to engage in research? That's, I think, an ongoing area where people are trying to think and figure out better ways to engage people when they may not have the same capacity to communicate verbally anymore, and just ongoing evolution of our methodologies, I think.
Thank you. Bill, do you have anything to add just from your own perspective of also engaging with research with other people with dementia as well as your own personal experience?
Again, the fact that we are being asked makes a big difference. That helps. But you can't underestimate, as Laura's mentioned, you can't underestimate, whether it's by Zoom or in person, the actual physical or mental or the stimulation that comes from the in-person meetings particularly is, to me, very, very important. But it's that social concept that's a key factor.
Thank you, Bill. And that ties in quite nicely with a question in the chat from Stephanie DeChassis. Stephanie, would you like to unmute to ask your question about ageist attitudes?
Yes, I think actually Bill responded to some of it. I assume that it is really hard to protect the voice and the space for people with dementia, and there's a lot of ageist attitude, especially for older people. So did you encounter some of these attitudes, and were they very open, or were they more like a covert and sort of behind the scenes, not wanting to say it outright to be politically correct, and is something hard. So how do you think we can ensure that in our programs and awareness raising about the rights, and especially the right to be heard, how do we fight these ageist attitudes?
It's a great question. And of course, I mean, I don't know if Bill, do you want to start or do you want me to start?
Well, one thing I've never found it a problem personally. Maybe because I'm more outgoing. I just like to get in there and talk with people. But I've also taken the view, which many of my friends have heard many, many times. It doesn't really matter what we say because we're not going to remember anyway. So I'll turn it back to Laura.
Yeah, I do think that there's ageist, ableist perspectives amongst researchers, amongst physicians on many levels. Some of them are not said aloud, but certainly sometimes they are said aloud. Even, you know, when we've had events where there are people living with dementia engaging and talking, you still have people come up and overtly express, you know, discrimination against people with dementia. And, you know, then it's challenging in trying to, you know, steer them. Often it has to be subtle ways at first, but it's, you know, the intersection of ageism where people are assuming people can't be involved because of their age, and certainly dementia where there's layers of additional stigma on top is a huge challenge. You know, people always think of, and you know, this is another thing that came from Roger Marple, Bill, in one of my later conversations. So he was another dementia advocate in Canada, who passed away about 1.5 years ago. But he talked about dementia specifically. People thought about the end stages, a reverse chronological view of dementia. And so they think about the end stages and assume that people can't engage anymore because they're thinking about people who's, you know, in end stages of most disease, right? People do have poor mobility and poor cognition and frailty. And so probably that the last period is going to be quite difficult, but people assume, you know, that is dementia. People assume often that is what older life looks like. And so, I mean, I think that we just need to keep talking about it and challenging that. I am convinced, not through my own research, my kids are 9 and 10, and I'm convinced that that's really the route to changing perspectives is, you know, they don't have the stigma ingrained against people who are older, not yet, and certainly not against people with dementia, because they know people like Bill and many others. And so I've heard them challenging, explaining to friends what dementia means and what it means, and, you know, sharing it in their class videos that, you know, we've done. And so I'm convinced that in the long game, that, you know, children are really where we can, if we change perspectives now, that's how we change society.
Perfect. Thank you. And Stephanie was actually on our Global Cafe speaking about intergenerational engagement.
I agree.
So yeah, we're all in good company here today. So I want to speak a little bit more about the DREAM project. What types of community wellness programs are targeted by the project? And what is the evidence of the impact of these programs on maintaining and improving individuals' physical, social, and mental well-being?
Yeah, so the DREAM project was an extension. So we started with DICE, which was focused on exercise and exercise providers. And the DREAM project was an expansion of that. And it expanded in 2 ways. We added information about healthy eating and meal times for a broader sense, and also, you know, making sure that our talking about the rights and health and promotion would be broadly relevant. But we also really wanted to think about how people get supports for their health and well-being. In Canada, certainly, you know, we have many different cultures, many different languages spoken. We know, unfortunately, the Alzheimer's Society is often not reaching all of those yet, and probably doesn't have the capacity to, not at this time anyway. So people with dementia who might speak another language or identify with a specific cultural group are often getting supports in those places, you know, whether it's a church or a mosque, or it is a cultural center. So we wanted to really make sure that the training was relevant to staff or volunteers that were supporting health and well-being of people living with dementia through activity programs, through shared meal times, through healthy eating in all of these spaces. So we tried to make sure that it was relevant to people with various degrees of training, and with different perspectives and experiences. So that's I guess that's the dream project. Is it's really meant for a broad range of staff and volunteers delivering these kind of supports. In terms of the benefits for wellness programs, I mean, when I'm speaking of wellness programs, our focus here was physical activity and healthy eating. I'd say that in dementia itself, there's probably more research around physical activity, and it seems to improve. Of course, there's various results, but there's, at least strong evidence that it improves function, physical fitness, independence. There's some good evidence that it'll improve, brain health and cognition, even once you have dementia. We also, when we talk to people itself, they certainly talk about the opportunities for social connection through physical activity and exercise programs. They talk about, gaining confidence because people can still get in, be active, show capacity, improve in things. And so that's certainly a degree of confidence that can often carry through to other elements of life. So that's really important. In terms of healthy eating, it's not as well studied in dementia as it is as a risk factor for dementia. But, people with dementia are adults and older adults, just like the rest of us. It's going to take care of your physical health, certainly, reduce the risk of frailty, of malnutrition, and, sarcopenia that's associated with that. There's no reason to think that people with dementia are different than that. And similarly to physical activity, when you ask them about meal times, that's obviously, many people have really meaningful experiences tied to meal times, eating together with families, with friends, values around food. So they also offer these social connections and values in ways that are often, I think, underestimated.
Perfect. Thank you. And it must have been quite interesting, I guess, trying to create some sort of training that is at a base level, like universally applicable. What was that like?
Yeah, I mean, and I've reflected on this a lot because, of course, there's nothing that's universally, you can't be universally applicable and perfect for any group. So really, if we wanted to do something, for example, for Indigenous peoples in Canada, we should, and actually you'd want to, partner with each community because they're not, all have the same values. If you wanted something that was ideal for the Chinese community or the South Asian community or various subgroups within that, we would partner specifically for them. But we tried to, but we had a great team that drew from all of those communities. And when there was differences of opinion, we tried to recognize that in there and explain why we're using, a specific word or a specific stance, so that people felt heard. And I do think that the people involved felt like their perspectives were included and integrated. And we have some, feedback from them, some research that has suggested as much. But it's not, it's not easy. Even I think one thing that always comes up is even just the terminology dementia. And is that the right term versus major neurocognitive disorder, which our French speakers in Canada use more often. So in our translated documents, we'll use that. Many of the Indigenous peoples in Canada don't have a word for dementia at all. Some of the translations are even, are held as even more stigmatizing than they are in English. So that even the word dementia is, certainly one that can be challenging.
That's really interesting. And I think also just building upon your point about there not being a universal or perfect program, if you go further, it's also for individuals. Not every individual is going to need the same things or appreciate the same things. So yeah, that's interesting. Bill, I'd like to turn over to you. So, as you shared when we met earlier this week, you are extremely physically active. How do you feel physical activity has influenced your experience of dementia, and what sorts of activities are you doing?
Well, one of the the biggest reasons I wanted to get involved with Laura was because of the research that she is doing on physical activity. And to me, I think it's one of the biggest benefits I've been able to take from everything I'm doing. It's to me what's keeping me going. Now, when you have a farm, excuse me, it doesn't matter if it's minus 30 out, excuse me, or plus 30, I'm outside. So every day I'm out in the fresh air. I believe it's 150 minutes of exercise they recommend per week that a person does. There's not a day I do that little. I'm way over that, especially at haying season. I also heat with wood. So I contract with beaver timber. Oh, at the back of my farm, I have 4 beaver ponds. I contract with beaver timber logging. They are allowed to knock trees down. They take the branches, etc., but they leave me the stumps. So I'm able to pull the stumps out, cut them up, and that's my firewood for the following winter. So I'm on a daily basis. I am outside. I am active. The average hay bale is somewhere around 60 pounds. I'm throwing hay bales daily. And from some of the research I've seen, even though when a brain cell dies, it will not replace itself. But with the increased blood flow as a result of the strenuous exercise, my understanding coming out of research in Australia is that the cells surrounding the dead cell will start to reprogram and fire across the space. So I think all of this combined is what's kept me to the position I'm at the present time.
Thank you. And yeah, I think as well, because you rely on all of these activities for living, I think sometimes with older people and people with dementia, because of these ableist and ageist assumptions, we almost bubble wrap people. We say, oh, no, you can't do that. You aren't allowed to. You have to be careful. Whereas for you, you're kind of making yourself go out there, and that can be really beneficial.
Yeah, the general attitude in the barn is, so you have dementia, big deal. Where's my hay?
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, and I think, Bill, you've talked about too that, after you got your diagnosis, the horses were really like what forced you to immediately keep going, in that, that idea that they need to be looked after. And you had more horses at that time.
As Laura mentioned, at the time I was diagnosed, we had 11 horses in the barn. 3 of my mares were due to foal within a 4-month period. And I was also eligible for early retirement from Ernst & Young. I thought, well, if they've given me 5 years, I'm not going to spend it behind a desk. I took immediate early retirement. And with that number of horses in the barn, shows coming up, etc., I basically said, okay, if I'm going to have to withdraw in 3 or 5 years, I will worry about it then. And I was forced to keep going on a normal daily routine for me. The other big decision we had to make was, do we rebreed our mares this coming April, which was 3 to 4 months after the diagnosis? So we decided, okay, we'll keep going as normal as possible for as long as possible. We rebred the mares the year after. Things were the same. We rebred the mares, and etc. And I'm still here.
It's an interesting way of framing things. Just one more year, one more year.
Okay.
Wow. Laura, could you speak a little bit more to so Bill was speaking a little bit to the physiology behind the brain and physical activity. Could you tell us just a little bit more, perhaps, about the science behind that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll say much of the science is done, pre a diagnosis of dementia, but, we know that the pathology, the changes in the brain start 20 years early. So in mine, before a diagnosis, often. So in my mind, there's no reason to think that the day that you have MCI, physical activity has different effects than in people with dementia. It just doesn't make sense, even though we often, in research, we treat them as 2 different groups of people. But this is a spectrum. And so, there's pretty broad benefits for physical activity. Certainly some of it's blood flow, and that's where we initially thought was the case is that, physical activity improves your cardiovascular heart, so it makes sense that it improves your brain health as well through vascular health. And certainly that's part of it. But we've also learned a lot over the last 20, 30 and more years that physical activity really promotes the growth factors in the brain as well that act on neurons and on other structures, such that people who are physically active have more growth of new neurons. They have more neuroplasticity, so more changes, more connections within neurons. So the branching, which creates, and some of this was part of what Bill was alluding to, more connection, so that there's different ways to do things, so that health of the neurons and their connections and the strength of the circuitry in the brain is better. There's more repair mechanisms. So no, if a brain cell has died, we're not going to have that one, regenerate, but you can repair the damage, whether it's to, the myelin that coats the neurons or to the structures. And so those, all those processes seem to be promoted through physical activity. And physical activity broadly also has anti-inflammatory effects. And so that probably affects, both the brain, but also, of course, the rest of your body as well. Physical activity acutely has some inflammation, but in the long term, because of that, your body develops its capacity to reduce inflammation.
Thank you. And just as a bit of a follow-up, so some individuals, they experience health conditions that limit their capacity for physical activity. How can they engage in activity in a way that's reflective of their capacity?
Yeah, and I will always say, physical activity, when we talk about it, we talk about hitting a moderate intensity of physical activity, but that is individualized. That really depends on the baseline fitness and function of the individual. And so people can do moderate intensity for someone who has, a significant health condition that has made them inactive for a while will look different than it will for Bill, who is extremely active and probably much more active than most of us on the call, if we're honest here. So that, if you're in a wheelchair, you can still do upper body strength. You can still, depending on the function of your legs, you may still be able to do, leg extensions that may have, maybe you can't support your weight, but you can have small weights. It may look like, the core physical activity that usually I recommend, wheelchair users aside, is walking. And that may be slower for some people and faster for others, but it's a core activity. It's also a functional activity for many people. We talk about, strength training. Strength training can be done through things like farming and through, vigorous gardening that challenges you. At this time of year in Canada, we're coming up to the break out all the gardens season. People are lifting bags of dirt to replenish their gardens, lifting great plants that strengthens. But we can also do more core exercises like a push-up. A push-up can be done on the floor, great for some people, but it can also be done against a wall for someone who doesn't have the same strength. So there's a lot of ways to adapt physical activity, both to the needs of the individual, as well as to the preferences of the individual.
Perfect, thank you. And I know Anna Sangster has a question. Anna, would you like to unmute?
Yeah, thanks, Kara. And this is going to be a somewhat silly question, but I've been listening to Bill, and he's mentioned his horses a few times. And I'm wondering whether that in and of itself has provided any kind of bit of a therapeutic process, kind of engaging with animals, and whether, Laura, you've seen any kind of benefits to people living with dementia and kind of working with animals or engaging with animals and kind of that, animal therapy. So just curious, I've heard your love a few times, Bill, and wondering whether that's been helpful for you.
The quick answer is yes. I'm 83. I still ride. I'm still riding horses. Basically, I think it's the activity, and as I mentioned earlier, being around animals. they couldn't care less if you have a diagnosis. Their first instinct is survival, and it's up to you to keep that going. Now, some of you may see this monster back here, but I have an Alaskan Malamute who considers himself management and I'm labor. So he has to have big walks in the bush every day. And fortunately, I've got about 3 miles of bush trails cut back through the bush behind me here, where we walk in the summer, we snowshoe during the winter, we ride. It's great training for the horses in that if you're trying to neck rein a horse and they see there's a tree in front of them, they get the idea very quickly. It's, yeah, they better turn. So yeah, I agree. Horses to me have been one of the key factors why I'm still here.
Yeah.
And
And yeah, I will add, and I don't profess to be an expert in this area, but there's certainly emerging research about the benefits of animals as supports and improving mental well-being amongst people with dementia. A lot of the research is in, kind of moderate to severe dementia where communication can be more challenging, but animals, certainly dogs and cats, can still bring a lot of comfort and support. I mean, I think even in terms of physical activity, people walking with their dogs is a meaningful activity, and it's one that's then seen as a positive experience. It's not seen as work, right? It's not seen as exercise. It's seen as a valued, meaningful activity for people that brings people joy. And so, I often think of, we always study exercise in this restricted clinical trials way, but why don't we make it this multi-component intervention that includes other people, that includes other animals, that includes, being outdoors, maybe not, in some of our winters, but, right, that's the multifaceted pieces that go together that are part of physical activity programs. And I know I took that off base, but I do think that there's a lot of value to certainly the mental well-being and the research isn't always what we'd call gold standard in terms, it's not a randomized controlled trial of animal support, but there's good evidence to suggest that animal supports can improve the well-being of people with dementia.
Laura,
Great,
being
thanks so much,
outside in
Laura.
our winters has nothing to do with it.
I know.
Maybe not to you, Bill, but I've been outside a few times and my feet freeze.
We had a winter physical activity. I have a student who is interested in understanding how do we promote winter physical activity. And she's just analyzing the data now, but it's interesting to see the various responses. Of course, there's people who are like, there is ice outside, it is -20, I'm not going outside. And then there's other people who say, that's what I like. I like being outdoors and I'm willing to go out and I'm willing to take the risk. I might have slightly higher risk of fall, but I'm at the point I'm going to do what I love and I'm going to do that. And there's people in between who say, okay, I'm going to be enjoy it a lot more outside. So I'll put spikes on my shoes and I'll put my heavy coat on and my heavy boots and I'm still going outside. And I might walk slightly different places, but I'm going to still engage in that way. But Bill, Bill is probably the one of the more extreme people in terms of enjoying that outdoors.
On a regular basis, I have some of the nursing students from Lakehead University, as well as some of the health sciences students, come out here on a Saturday. And if the snow conditions are right, we go snowshoeing, then come back and have coffee, hot chocolate, whatever. So I've got the social aspect as well as the physical aspect.
Yeah, and so much of that ties together when it's like a meaningful form of physical activity.
It's always nice too to be able to walk them.
Really make them work for it. I like it. I like it. So just sharing general comments in the chat that everyone is really appreciating, Bill, especially your stories and attitudes. Laura, I know we're wrapping up shortly, but as you shared, the DREAM project is intended to equip community service providers or kind of just the general varying levels of community members who are engaged with people with dementia with the knowledge and skills to support people with dementia. So what sorts of things do these service providers or community members feel ill-equipped to respond to when engaging with someone with dementia?
I think it comes back to lack of knowledge and stigma, which I think it was Stephanie that was talking about, right? That when people think of dementia, they think of the end stages, one, which are more challenging, and they think of, behavioral problems, and people are scared of that. And so I think a lot of them have no training, no education in dementia. And so if they have any knowledge, it's from a handful of experiences where it's probably not the average person, but it's, the time they know it's someone with dementia is when they've had a challenge, or it's a personal experience. And so, what we share is one, the broad range of people, what dementia is, right? To understand that, yes, it's mild, there's mild stages and there's severe stages, and there's people who experience different symptoms, different physical changes, sensory changes, cognitive changes. And we also talk about behavior in the context of it being communication, right? That to pay attention to the behavior and then try to understand why it's happening. Pay attention to the context, what interactions they've had, what noise is there. And when I think when you think of, behavior as a form of communication rather than just a problem, it changes everything, right? You realize that you have some control over that experience. And so, any behavioral problems that emerge, which, I would go around that, but hopefully I think they realize there's some control over creating an inclusive program that can support people where you don't really have a lot of these problems. We've run a physical activity program at our university for a number for people with dementia for a number of years now, and behavior is not a major issue in that group that is quite diverse in terms of stage and communication abilities. And I think, when we see someone come in that's frustrated, we think, oh, maybe they had a bad time in the parking lot, right? Just like anyone else, and they're frustrated now. And we try to create a space where, they can have quiet if they need quiet, they have the amount of support that they need. And so reduce, that, but I think that's really important, is people have these stigmatized views, especially around behavior, and that if we can teach them how to change their thinking around it, that makes dementia a whole lot less scary to them. Because I think that's mostly what it is, that they're kind of scared of working with people with dementia, and we can change their views.
Yeah, and I love that framing. Yeah, go ahead, Phil.
Dr. Nisha Sutherland is a professor of nursing at Lakehead University here. And she and I do presentations to the third-year nursing class. And in many cases, the contact, or what the nursing students know about dementia, is more towards the final stages of this. And they're quite surprised that I can interact with them. And that's come as a shock to some of them. And again, some of those nursing students are some who come out and do the walks with me.
Yeah, so providing them that lived experience of, oh no, just, have my ways of communicating and being a person just like any other person. That's really fascinating. So we are approaching the end of our session, but I know, Anna, you had one last question. Anna, would you like to ask your question?
I do have one last question.
Perfect.
Bill, if you've shown me anything today, is that there's just an absolutely huge range of obviously experience within, this experience of dementia. One of the questions I have is around caregiving. Obviously, there's going to be different needs for different individuals. I'm curious to know, from a patient perspective, what you feel you need from, a potential caregiver, or what would be important to you. And then Laura, from your perspective, what do you see as some of the needs from the caregiving community?
As Laura knows, my wife died a little over 4 years ago. And since then, I live on my own out here. However, having said that, my neighbors are fantastic. Elaine Wiersma, University, Lakehead University, fantastic. I have so many friends, neighbors, contacts through the university that I am no time do I feel alone, or if I do need something, I'm just a phone call away from it.
So kind of those robust support systems around you are really helpful.
Absolutely. And the fact that I'm so socially active, I think has a lot to do with it. I also play with two different bands in Thunder Bay that we play in the seniors' homes on a regular basis. And one band, I have been the bass player for the last 49 years. And eventually we'll learn to play it properly.
Thanks, Bill.
And I love that idea of that they're probably reciprocal relationships too. It's not just
Oh, absolutely.
Exactly. And that's really key.
Yeah. And so, and I'm not sure the care, are you, when, well, I'll speak to both because there's kind of the caregiving community that is, you know, family or friends that are providing usually unpaid support, but are the core. And then there's, of course, paid caregivers as well. But I think, I mean, in working, especially working with care partners, I think, you know, some of these ideas are the same where you're really seeing what the person needs that day and not, one of the hardest things is not looking forward too much and not looking back to what might have been and see what they need today, because that, you know, varies over time, but it also varies day to day, right? People have good days and bad days. And I think, you know, in the DICE training, which obviously is a different group with less intense supports, but it's, you know, kind of playing detective to understand, you know, what they need that day. I would also say that the caregiving community, especially people who are looking after more significant needs, you know, what we have to do to support them is really important. And because they also need, you know, care for their health and well-being, and that transfers forward, right, to the person with dementia. And it's hard. So we need, you know, respite or programs that run either in parallel or integrate, but take them into account as full participants that need to benefit from their health, you know, and their health as well. But I think, you know, the challenge is that the same, you know, people come into caregiving with different perceptions of dementia, just like everyone else. And the same with people with dementia. Often they come in with stigmatized views of dementia. And so seeing the person where they're at that day, I think, and not, you know, either forward or ahead is really important. I think from the, and I'd probably say the same for the professional caregiving perspective. People come in, and I know in Canada, people don't receive enough support for education or continuing education. They are not well compensated, you know, the people who are providing professional caregiving. And so I think really that's the same thing, is really seeing the person where they're at, treating them as people, I think is really important, whether it's at home or in, you know, long-term care, speaking to them as their people, even if they can't always speak back, I think are the challenges. And it really comes back to stigma at the end of the day, but how can we change and evolve that over time?
Thanks so much, Linda.
I just like to add too that living with animals, I think that the caregiving is reciprocal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that idea of contributing and you're getting something as well. So I think what I've learned today is the importance of seeing people as full people and where they're at. And yeah, I really liked, Laura, especially your mention of just being here now and seeing, really interacting with people on that level. So I will ask you very, very briefly for key takeaway messages. But first, I would like to introduce our next week's topic and speakers. Please join our discussion next week with Ellen Graham and Francis Zeno-Eden, who will be discussing the Global Rally as a part of the Age with Rights campaign. So for those of you who do not know, the Open-Ended Working Group on Aging is occurring in May, where governments will be potentially discussing the creation of a convention on the rights of older persons. Next week will also be the 4th anniversary of the IFA Global Café series, so please do join us on this occasion. So back to you, Laura and Bill. One sentence. Could you both share a key takeaway message to leave our audience with today? So I'm not sure who would like to go first. I think, Laura, I've been asking you to go first most of it, so I'll leave Bill this time.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess if there's one thing I'd have to leave as a message, and this came down to me from Dr. Peter Nealons, who is a piano player with one of the groups we play with. But Peter's famous words to me is, "Don't believe everything a doctor tells you."
Challenge those
Okay.
perceptions. I like it.
Yeah, I love that. And I think I would say, don't underestimate what you can learn from people with dementia. You're not only support them and support them in their wellness, but like take the opportunity to learn, listen, watch, because at all stages of dementia, I think we have things we can learn from them. So by listening and watching.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining, and thank you to Luana, as always, for helping run this whole show. So have a fantastic weekend, and we hope to see you next week. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.